Welcome to Tanach Study and to Sefer Study. I'm Nachliel Selavan, and you are watching Archaeology Snapshot on Sefer Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes. This is really exciting. If you've noticed the background picture, it's the picture of Aliyah LaRegel, of everybody coming up to Yerushalayim, a picture which I'm using courtesy of the Temple Institute Jerusalem. And the reason I chose this picture is because we are now in the 7th year in Shnat HaShemitah, on which, in the time of the Beit HaMikdash, would be the mitzvah of hakel, of gathering. I thought it would just be a nice introduction to talk about hakel, since this is really one of the first episodes we're doing since Rosh Hashanah. If you're watching this, of course, in the order that it's being recorded, but however it is, this is when it's recorded. Fun fact to know. Now, what are we basically gathered here to do? We are here today, gathered here, Nikhalnu Hayom, to talk about when is the story happening, who are the main players, where are the main locations, with some highlights from history and archaeology. And once again, with Sifrut HaChochma, with the wisdom literature, we're challenged because there's not so much to talk about in terms of archaeology, because we are talking about literature. There's very little to say except for the environment in which the story is told, and the metaphors that are used, the examples that are used from the world of the ancient Near East. And therefore, there's always some kind of surprising thing that you can look at, and I'm really excited to share some of these things with you. Without further ado, let us go to where the story tells us that it begins. Divrei Kohelet ben David, Melech b'Yerushalayim. He says, Ani Kohelet haiti Melech b'Yerushalayim. I am Kohelet, I was a king in Yerushalayim. Now, when exactly is this story happening? And just a fun anecdote, the book of Kohelet was actually found in Qumran in Cave 4, so if you look it up online, I actually put some information in the description below. There is links to the Dead Sea Scrolls project by the Israel Museum, where you can actually see in pretty high resolution all of the images of all of the almost 900 and something scrolls that have been found in the Dead Sea area, Megillat Midbar Yehuda. And I put the two links to the two Kohelet scrolls found in Qumran. So that's cool stuff. That's the picture that you're seeing here is one of them. You can pause and try to read this. You can look at the links below. But do not forget to smash that like button, the thumbs up button right down there. Take a few extra seconds to do it. Thank you. The story is taking place in Yerushalayim, and Chazal tell us that this Kohelet is Shlomo HaMelech. And Shlomo wrote 3 books. He wrote Sefer Shir HaShirim, he wrote Mishle, and he wrote Kohelet. Now, we covered Shir HaShirim and we covered Mishle, so I'm going to use some of the references to some of the things we discussed there, which means that you can always go back there to talk about the linguistics and when it was it, and the socio-economic environment in which the story is written. All of these things are pretty important. I'm not going to repeat those things. What I am going to do is try to talk about something a little bit new. Now, Chazal say that in addition to the fact that Shlomo HaMelech wrote those 3 books, it's Chizkiyahu HaMelech v'si'ato who actually wrote them down, who wrote down Yeshayahu, who wrote down Mishle, Shir HaShirim, and Kohelet. So this is one of 4 books that were written down in the time of Chizkiyahu, and as I mentioned in Mishle, that can mean a lot of different things. In other words, it doesn't have to be that the words are word for word exactly as Shlomo HaMelech said them. It could mean that, it could not mean that. The point is that it's up for discussion in Chazal and in the Mefarshim, and I'm not going to weigh in on that, but the point is that's an important conversation when it comes to the linguistics of the book. When it comes to linguistics, we have to look at Sefer Kohelet, Sifrut HaChochma, the wisdom literature, in context of other ancient Near Eastern texts. I'm going to show you very soon that there's some really interesting things that help us understand Pshat in Pesukim, that Mefarshim for hundreds of years were trying to figure out what does this Pasuk mean, and because we have these ancient Near Eastern texts, we can understand or offer a Pshat, a simple meaning to what a verse that Kohelet is saying, that everybody at the time knew what it meant, and we sort of forgot what it means because of, the time lapse and the fact that we don't know how to read Sumerian or Akkadian. Now, the topics of Sifrut HaChochma, the literature of the ancient Near East, I've mentioned this as well earlier in Mishle. There are parallels to the kinds of conversations that we have in Sifrut HaChochma and Tanakh. Obviously, we are sort of bouncing off the cultures of the ancient Near East, sometimes using them as a springboard, a platform for discussing other things, maybe recontextualizing them, maybe referring to them, having conversation with them. So that's totally fine. We know all of that stuff. But what I want to point out is that in Sefer Kohelet, there's a lot of words which show up very few times in Tanakh and only later in the Persian period, such as Asiti li ganot ufardesim, I made for myself gardens and paradise, which actually means an orchard with fruit in Persian. right, is one of the reasons that some scholars will say that this book is actually from the Persian period and it's later. And as I mentioned also in Shir HaShirim where it's mentioned, the fact that later words show up in books that claim to be earlier isn't necessarily an issue, because it's really a matter of how language works, how words get around, and words can circulate for a very long time until they're written down and become integrated in the language, and that's totally fine. So there's a lot of discussion about those things out there. I just don't want it to be, terrifying territory and monsters, even though we actually are going to talk about monsters. And if you remember our last episode in Iyov, we spoke about Skila and Charybdis, or Livyatan Nachash Bariach, Livyatan Nachash Akalaton. If you haven't watched it, please go back and watch that awesome video on Iyov. I'm telling you, it is so exciting. I keep on seeing stuff in museums until now, and I go like, oh my gosh, the Odyssey, Skila and Charybdis, Livyatan Nachash Bariach, Akalaton. Like, wow, that was just such an amazing revelation. And yeah, I'm getting excited about linguistics. But anyway, before I get to a little bit more linguistics, I want to mention that the environment which is described in Kohelet, like Haiti Melech B'Yerushalayim, the various luxurious things which Shlomo Melech describes really correspond and parallel the things that are mentioned in Shir HaShirim and in Mishle, which sort of work with Melachim as well in terms of describing the geopolitical and socioeconomic situation in Yerushalayim and Eretz Yisrael that's supposed to be there at the time that Shlomo Melech was king. And so it sort of makes sense that he was the ruler at the time. But the nature of this particular book is kind of different. It's like the musings of a philosopher who may be speaking to people, Makil Kehilot, but he may also be saying things to himself, which is later on shared with the public. I mean, who knows exactly how this was conveyed to people? But the sort of things that he talks about are really fascinating. And some of them are very unique and stand out in the corpus of literature of the ancient Near East. And I'm going to give an example of that really soon. So he speaks about all kinds of social issues, existential issues, issues of life and death, of transience, of happiness, of young age and old age, all kinds of very philosophical musing, which have to do with life and especially with the futility of life. Havel havalim amar Kohelet. But even more than that, what Kohelet identifies is that Ra'iti et kol kishrona ma'aseh, I've seen all of the creativity and the deeds that human beings are doing under the sun. V'hi kinat ish mere'eu. It's all based on competition, which is basically a very rudimentary explanation of the Darwinian drives which lead to all the creativity that we have in the world, whether it's biological creativity or it's technological creativity. It's really all about survival and trying to gain the upper hand and trying to increase my success. It's really incredible that he was able to perceive that it's kin'ah, that it's this jealousy that drives creativity forward. So on the one hand, it kind of can sound like an old person sitting there going like, hey, it's all futility and it's all there. But the truth is, these are very profound statements about the nature of the world. Ashkenazim have a minhag to read Kohelet on the Shabbat Chol HaMoed of Sukkot, specifically because it relates to, of course, a lot of cycles, which has to do with Sukkot, the Hosha'anot that we do, circling the Mizbeach and speaking about the cycle of the year, Tekufat HaShana, cycle of the rain, and later on we have the Hakafot of Simchat Torah, which sort of converged onto the holiday of Sukkot, even though that's a much later development, we can say. Because Simchat Torah, used to be once every 3 years and in different times throughout the world, but we're not going to talk about that now. But it's also the time of Simcha, of happiness, which seems counterintuitive if you look at Kohelet, unless you understand that there is immense happiness in appreciating the opportunity in one moment where everything else, where you realize that things are going to eventually die. There's this transience, things are passing through. And yet I have an opportunity to act and to create meaning in my life through engaging in the world, even with the simplest things like a branch of arava, of willow or something like that. So it's a really incredible idea if you consider how Kohelet came to be associated with Sukkot. Now, this one example I want to talk about in Kohelet, which really wraps up the book, and according to Chazal, they were actually considering hiding the book because there are so many confusing mixed messages about it that make you wonder, like, what is going on here? But in the bottom line, it's his vision of God, of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which kept him in the Tanach, in the Chavdaled Sfarim, or in what we call the canon. So he ends the book with Sof Davar HaKol Nishma, Et HaElohim Yira ve'et mitzvotav shemor ki ze kol ha'adam. It's Yirat Hashem is the be-all and end-all. The way he talks about God in this book is obviously very different than the epics of the ancient Near East, which talk about the gods creating the humans in order to serve them and do their hard work and toil. I mean, it's a completely different vision. But God is also transcendental. He's so detached from our world down here. We are so messed up. I mean, we have problems, and God is perfect. Everything God does is straight, is righteous. האלוהים ברא את האדם ישר, והמה ביקשו חשבונות רבים. God created humankind straight. It's us who ruin everything with our imagination and what we try to do with it. And we try to sort of, mangle reality to make it work the way we want it to work. And then we complain that it all doesn't work out. So it's a very advanced vision of an existential kind of God, a God of being, a monotheistic God, which is really beruach, in the spirit of the way we relate to Kadosh Baruch Hu. And I just want to mention, in terms of language, it's really neat to find out that Kohelet is the only place in all of Tanakh where a whole lot of words, dozens of words, show up. I'm just going to read you a few of them, and you realize, like, oh my gosh, I have never heard those words outside of Kohelet. So, for example, Aviona, Asupot, Bachurot. Like, really? Bachurot does not show anywhere else? Are you kidding me? Right? Bitachon. Wow, that does not show up anywhere else in Tanakh, right? Batel, Gumatz, Holelut, Yokshim, Hatchatim, Chisaron, Yitaron, Kisharon, Sichlut, Einyan, Takif. I mean, it goes on and on and on and on. Very, very special. So, Sefer Kohelet is unique in terms of its language in Tanakh, but it's also unique in terms of its view of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in context of the ancient Near East and the philosophical things that they usually talk about. And we see from the references that he makes and the geopolitical and socioeconomic situation described between the lines by references that he corresponds to the other books written by and about Shlomo HaMelech. And speaking of language and mysteries that come from the ancient Near East, let's move on to the next point. There is a curious passage in which Kohelet talks about a situation where Tovim Hashnayim min ha'echad. It's always better to be together. Why is that? Because, well, he goes through a list of different things. If you're cold at night and you're in the forest or something like that, you can warm each other up. But if you're alone, well, you're cold, right? And then he says something really interesting, which Mefarshim, commentators for centuries, have been trying to figure out what exactly does it mean. If somebody attacks one of you, hashnayim ya'amdu negdo, two will stand before him. So you have the advantage in numbers. V'ahut ha'meshulash lo b'meira yinatek. And this third triangular triple string, thread, rope, won't easily come apart. What on earth does this mean? Now, ladies and gentlemen, we just came out of Parashat Noach. When it comes to archaeology, Parashat Noach, I hope you follow the podcast on Tanach Study, on Parashat Study Plus, where we discuss the flood and all these other things. But there are other stories in the ancient Near Eastern literature, especially the story of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, which talk about a flood. Why am I talking about this now? Because in the Epic of Gilgamesh in the British Museum, and this is the flood story from the Epic of Gilgamesh, there is the story of the king of Erech, which we hear about in Torah. Erech, Akkad, Chalneh, Be'eretz Shinar. This is in the area of Akkad, Sumer, right? The king of Erech goes to the cedar forest with his friend Enkidu to fight the terrible, terrifying monster, Humbaba, the monster, protector of the cedar forest. And Humbaba, the terrifying, the terrible, is a really scary creature to fight. But eventually, Gilgamesh and Enkidu defeat Humbaba. And the speech that ensues before Enkidu runs away, where they tell each other, we will be strong, we will survive against this monster Humbaba, is the following. And I specifically brought down a Hebrew translation because this is where you see the connection. Atzor Enkidu, stop, don't go anywhere. Lo yamut hasheni, the second is not going to die. Hasfina hanigreret lo titba, the sinking ship shall not sink. Et hachut hameshulash ish lo yinatek, nobody will undo the triple rope. Azor li ata, you help me. Va'ani ezor lecha, umi yuchal lanu, and I'll help you, and who could stand before us? Here we have a glimpse of a phrase, a reference in its original context, which meant there's this rope, this powerful triple woven rope from a ship, which you can use to pull the ship to stop it from sinking. And Hachuta Meshulash Lo Bimra Yinatek was the end of that phrase. The beginning of the phrase apparently got lost, and this happens in languages. Certain words just, travel throughout history, and people remember their original meaning, which is Hachuta Meshulash Lo Bimra Yinatek, the triple woven rope won't easily come apart, just means that together we're better. And you forgot that it's related to the fact that that rope is connected to a ship and you need to pull the ship to make sure it doesn't sink into the water. So it used to make sense with the full sentence, but at a certain point in history, people understood the reference. And so it just means, oh yeah, together we're better. Now there's many explanations in Chazal and in the Mefarshim about this, but I wanted to show that using the literature from archaeology and the ancient Near Eastern texts, a very ancient Sumerian flood myth, you're able to understand Peshat in Tanakh that was hitherto unknown. Incredible, right? All right, let's move on to our final and last point, which has to do with dreams. Dreams are mentioned a few times in Kohelet, such as in Perek Daled, Ki ba hachalom berov einyan, or Ki berov chalomot v'havalim udvarim harbe, and he seems to be dismissing dreams as like, yeah, dreams are full of all kinds of stuff. I mean, go to Freud, to a Freudian psychologist who'll do this psychoanalysis and analyze all your dreams. Dreams are full of so much clutter that has something to do with your subconscious, but it's all a mess. And of course, if you study the 9th chapter of Brachot, in Talmud Bavli, in the Gemara, you'll know that there's a whole discussion about dreams being full of nonsense, but also deep truths inside there. Now, what's unique about this is that Kohelet seems to be saying that dreams are a bunch of nonsense, except that this doesn't sort of add up, because throughout all the rest of Tanakh, anytime we hear about dreams are some serious business. I mean, obviously there are dreams which are nonsense, and then there's dreams which actually mean something. So, for example, the dreams of Yaakov, to go back to Eretz Canaan. The dreams of Yosef, those got him into a lot of trouble, but they were true. The dreams of Sarah Mashkim and Sarah Ophim, the ministers of Paro in jail. The dreams of Paro. So how could you come along and say dreams are nonsense? Unless there needs to be a little bit more of a nuanced reading of these dreams. And so these texts from ancient Babylon are actually texts which talk about different types of dreams and how to figure out the difference between dreams that mean something and dreams that don't mean something. So the topic of dreams was a really important topic in the ancient Near East. And I want to just pause on the topic of dreams in archaeology as an introduction to the next episode, which is going to be Daniel, even though there's another episode after this. But in terms of when I'm recording it, you should know, if you're following, in this year, Daniel's going to be the next one, and that's where we have a Yosef-like character, a charismatic character, serving in the court of the king of the world at the time. Daniel serving in the court of Nebuchadnezzar II, in his palace in Babylon, interpreting his dreams. But unlike Yosef, who had to hear the dream and interpret it, he had to recreate what the dream was and then to interpret it. And that dream has incredible consequence to the unfolding of history as we know it. So with this, I'm going to leave you and say that Hayinu kecholmim, it was all like a dream, but which dream? A real dream, a bad dream? And that's hopefully how we're going to kick off Sefer Daniel in our next episode. So I want to thank you so much for watching Kohelet. Remember to give us a thumbs up and share this video with other people. Tell people about it and reach out to us. There's lots of information in the description. You can reach out and we can have a conversation about new stuff, things you want to know about in Sefer Daniel. You have a week to work on it. And if you've already missed the opportunity, well, it's like a dream. Thank you, and I'll see you on the next one.